First thing Master Handler Orva told us was not the Vel-Krath's name. He told us its record: 63 years, 41 handler trainees, 41 injuries ranging from 2 cracked ribs to 1 collapsed lung, 1 severed secondary tendon in a Keth cadet's lower arm, and 1 Vel-Krath who had been carried out of the pen on a stretcher, with both of her tertiary limbs broken at the mid-joint. The Vel-Krath had required 11 months of rehabilitation. She was, Orva said, one of the finest handler graduates the Academy had ever produced. She had gone on to manage a Tier 3 predator preserve on the outer arc of the Shal system. She had declined, formally and in writing, to ever enter a Vel-Krath pen again. He delivered all of this without inflection. He was Keth, four-eyed, secondary ribcage visible as a hard ridge beneath his handler's tunic, tertiary arms folded against his lower torso in the posture Keth use when they want you to understand that what they are about to say is final. He stood at the front of the observation gallery above the pen, and we stood in a row behind the glass, and he recited the injury record the way a magistrate reads a sentencing document. Not to frighten us, to make the weight of what we were looking at land correctly. The Vel-Krath was so pleased below us in the pen. I had read the species file before the rotation began, because I read every species file before any rotation began. It was a habit I had brought from Earth and found no reason to abandon. The file said, hexapodal apex predator, primary habitat subterranean and lower canopy arboreal, native to the Vel-Krath range on Keth Orval's third continent. Body mass up to 400 kilograms in mature specimens. 6 limbs, the forward 2, evolved from prehensile hunting appendages. Those were the ones that had done the damage in most of the logged incidents. Neurological structure: distributed trinodal, no single-point control. Sensory package: sonar primary, thermal secondary, chemical tertiary. It did not navigate by vision in the way most Academy species did. The eyes were present but vestigial by comparison, deep-set, pale, used mostly for light-level detection underground. What the file had not conveyed, and what the observation glass now showed me, was the quality of its stillness. The Vel-Krath was sitting in the center of the pen. Not pacing, not testing the perimeter, not sleeping in the corner, the way the large felid analogs tended to do when they weren't being provoked. It was sitting, 6 limbs settled beneath it in a configuration that looked almost architectural, and it was pointing all 4 of its eyes at the observation glass above. It knew we were there. The Vel-Krath does not habituate, Orva said. He had a way of spacing his sentences that the Keth use when they are translating from their own conceptual register into something the rest of us. Each word placed. Precisely, 63 years Bios in feds in this pen, and it has been examined in this pen. It has been studied, catalogued, measured, and assessed in this pen. It has had more contact with sentient beings than any Vel-Krath in recorded captivity. None of that contact has altered its threat response. It does not tolerate approach. It does not accept dominance. It does not distinguish between a handler it has seen 40 times and one it has never seen before. Every entry into that pen is, to the Vel-Krath, first entry. He paused. One of my fellow cadets, Tevsor, a Vel-Krath exchange student, secondary and tertiary limbs, both in perfect working order, who had been studying the pen with the expression his species uses for calculated assessment, made a small sound that might have been a question forming. Handler trainees will enter the pen in 3 sessions, Orva continued, answering the question that hadn't been asked yet. The protocol is mandatory. Compliance rod at full charge, held in the primary hand, barrel pointed down. Entry through the north gate, single file. You will stand at the north wall. You will not advance. The Vel-Krath will approach. When it approaches within 2 body lengths of the nearest cadet, the lead handler, that is me, will engage the rod at low setting. The animal will withdraw. You will hold position. This cycle repeats until the session timer ends, at which point you exit through the north gate, in the same single-file order in which you entered. No deviation from this sequence is permitted. He looked at us then, all 4 eyes, the upper pair and the lower pair, locking sequentially across the row of us the way Keth do, when they want to be certain everyone in the room understands that what they just said applies to everyone in the room equally. Deviation from protocol, he said, is how cadets leave this rotation in the infirmary. I was the youngest cadet in the cohort. 17. The Academy's minimum enrollment age was 16, and most cadets arrived at 17 or 18 after completing their species standard pre-enrollment tracks. I had tested directly secondary system on an accelerated placement examination. I mention this not because it matters to what happened, because it explains why I was standing at the end of the row, and why Tevsor was standing next to me with the particular quality of Vel-Krath. Attention. That means they have already assigned you a preliminary capability ranking and are waiting to see if it needs revision. My name is Ren Vasquez. I grew up in a part of Mexico where the cattle ranches still ran open-range operations on land that bordered secondary growth, scrubland, and where the scrubland held things that were not gentle. I know what it is to be in a pen with an animal that could kill you. I know what it is to stand still when every nerve in your body is telling you to move. I know what it is to wait. These are not combat skills. They are not the kind of thing that shows up on an academy placement examination. They are not in any file. Looked at the Vel-Krath below the glass and I thought, it wants to know what you are. It wants to know if you're a threat or a resource or something it doesn't have a category for yet. It has been in this pen for 63 years and every sentient being that has ever come through that north gate has behaved exactly the same way. Pliance rod charged, held in the primary hand, barrel pointed down, standing at the north wall. 63 years of the same thing. Of course it doesn't habituate. You've never given it anything to habituate to. I didn't say any of this. I was 17 at the end of the row, and Dreshorva had not asked for my assessment of his 63-year-old protocol. I just looked at the Vel-Krath, and after a moment the Vel-Krath looked back at me, pale eyes adjusting their angle by 2 degrees. And I had the very clear sensation, the kind you get sometimes with a large animal when something in its posture shifts without any of its limbs moving, that it was thinking something similar. The first search was shelled for the following morning. We entered through the north gate at the 7th bell, single file, compliance rods at full charge, Dreshorva at the front. There were 7 of us in the cohort. Tevsor, a Shalhari cadet named Orvindeth, who had 3 years of prior handler experience on his homeworld, and who carried himself accordingly. 2 Keth second years whose names I had not yet learned to distinguish by tone marker. An Earthborn returnee named Sela, who had been raised on a Vel-3 orbital station, and who moved through space, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate corridors designed for bodies different from their own, and me. The Vel-Krath was in the center of the pen. Same position as the day before. Posture I now understood was not a resting posture, but an observation posture. The architectural fold of the limbs that let it stay perfectly, still while processing everything in its perceptual range. It knew we were there before the gate latched behind us. I watched the forward pair of limbs shift by perhaps 3 centimeters. A redistribution of weight that moved the animal's center of gravity forward, without anything that looked like movement from a distance. It was ready. Dreshorva spoke the entry command, a low-tone sequence on a channel the Vel-Krath's sonar range could register, which the Academy had determined long ago was necessary to give the animal consistent cues about the session's beginning and end, the only concession towards something that might, in 100 years or so, approach habituation. Then he stopped at the north wall, and we stopped behind him, and the Vel-Krath began to move. It moved the way water moves through a narrow channel. Not fast, not slow, continuous and without apparent effort. 6 limbs cycling in the subterranean gait pattern the file described, body low, head forward. All 4 eyes fixed on the front of the line where Dreshorva stood with his compliance rod, held exactly as the protocol required. 2 body lengths from the nearest cadet, which was Dreshorva, the rod engaged. The Vel-Krath did not recoil. It stopped. That was the distinction I noticed immediately. Not a flinch, not a retreat, but a decision. It stopped moving at 2 body lengths, and it stood there for 3 full seconds while the low-setting pulse ran, and then it withdrew. Not rapidly, not in pain. It walked backward 6 paces, turned with a precision that suggested the forward-facing eyes mattered less to its spatial model than its sonar did, and returned to the center of the pen. The session timer read 22 minutes remaining. This happened 4 more times. Each time the Vel-Krath closed to 2 body lengths. Each time the rod engaged. Each time the animal stood for a moment, and then withdrew. On the third approach, it was watching the end of the line instead of the front. Watching where I was standing, I held my rod in the correct position, barrel down, full charge. I stood at the north wall, and I watched it watch me, and I thought about cattle, about the way a bull reads a room, not the people in it individually, not at first but the shape of the room as a single unit, looking for the thing that doesn't fit the pattern. Looking for the anomaly. I was the anomaly in this room. I was the only one not issuing a chemical signal that the compliance rod's charge leaves on Keth biology, which is a faint burn smell that other Keth would register as stress. Sela didn't issue it either. Earth-born humans on Vel-Krath stations tend to develop a different chemical baseline than Earth-raised humans. But the burn smell from stress-activated Keth biochemistry was still a foreign signal. Skin. I had no idea what I was putting into the pen's air. I knew what I wasn't. I wasn't afraid. Not because I'm brave. Because I was 17, and I had spent enough time in pens, with things that could kill me, to know that fear in that context is a decision you make about whether the animal has permission to define the terms of the encounter. I had stopped making that decision by the time I was 12. The animal on the other side of the fence either has your number or it doesn't, and if it does, then fear doesn't help you and calm might. The session ended. We exited through the north gate single file. Dresh Orva said nothing until we were back in the observation gallery, and then he ran the standard post-session debrief, which consisted of asking each cadet to report their physical status and any deviation from protocol. No deviations, no injuries. He noted on his reporting tablet that the Vel-Krath had increased its observation focus toward the rear of the line in sessions 3 through 5. He filed that as a standard approach variance note, which was apparently a category that existed in the reporting system. That night, I sat in the Academy's second library, the one that held the physical archive materials, not the digital catalog, and found every handler's log that had been filed for the Vel-Krath pen over the past 63 years. There were 41 injury reports, all of which I read. There were also 912 session logs, most of which were single-page standard format entries: entry time, approach count, rod engagement count, exit time, status, routine. It took 3 hours to read through them all, at the pace that lets you actually absorb what you're reading, as opposed to the pace that lets you say you've read something. I kept notes on a borrowed Academy pad, writing numbers by hand the way I had been taught in secondary school, before the placement exams, and before anyone thought I was going anywhere. Unusual. Approach count, average engagement distance, sessions per year, per cohort rotation, per handler generation. The data was consistent across the full 63-year span in a way that nothing biological should be that consistent. Same approach count per session, same engagement distances, same center return pattern. 6 decades of a smart animal doing exactly the same thing because 6 decades of handlers had given it no other option. I was looking for something in the approach variance data, how close the animal had gotten, across sessions, across years. Whether there was any pattern in the exceptions. The sessions where it had gotten closer than 2 body lengths before the rod engaged, the ones where it had deviated from the center return pattern. There were 14 such sessions across 63 years. I read all of them. In 11 of the 14, the variance occurred during sessions with unusually small cohort groups, 3 cadets or fewer. In 8 of the 14, the incident logs noted that a cadet in the group had been present in the pen for a previous unscheduled maintenance visit, which meant their chemical signature was already partially known to the animal's catalog. In 2 of the 14, the variance note said only, behavior atypical, no proximate cause identified. In one of them, filed 23 years ago by a handler whose name the log listed as assistant, handler Dresh Orva, in his 3rd year at the Academy, the variance note said, subject approached within 1 body length of Cadet Ursavath, Kahari 3rd rotation, who was standing at end of line, duration of close approach, 11 seconds. No rod engagement due to protocol spacing gap at rear of line, no injury. Cadet Ursavath remained stationary throughout. Animal withdrew voluntarily. Cause unknown. Recommend review of rear line spacing protocol to prevent recurrence. Ursavath, I looked the name up. She had graduated from the academy 31 years ago, specialized in advanced predator management, and was currently the senior handler at the Keth Orville Wildlife Research Station on the second continent. She had published 14 papers on Vel-Krath behavioral patterns. She had never been injured in a handler session. I thought about that for a while. Then I thought about what remained stationary throughout looked like from the inside. The second session was 3 days later. Same formation, same protocol, same north wall, Dresh Orva at the front, me at the end. The Vel-Krath came out of the center of the pen differently this time. Not the low-body subterranean gait. Upright, the forward pair of limbs elevated. The way the files said they moved when they were doing close-range chemical sampling in an environment where they wanted to read the air at multiple heights simultaneously. It wasn't charging, it was investigating. It went to the front of the line first, covering the first two approach and withdraw cycles in the same pattern as before, the rod engaging, the animal stopping, the animal retreating. On the third approach, it angled left, not toward the front of the line, down the line. Dresh Orva tracked the movement. His rod raised slightly, not an engagement, a readiness. The Vel-Krath stopped at 4 body lengths from me, with its forward limbs elevated, and all 4 eyes pointing in my direction, and I could feel, not metaphorically, not emotionally, but as a physical reality in the air between us, the sonar pulse traveling across the space, a regular interval, measuring. I did not raise my rod. This was not a deviation from protocol, technically. Protocol said the lead handler engaged the rod when the animal came within 2 body lengths of the nearest cadet. It was still 4 body lengths away. Nothing in the written protocol required me to raise my rod at 4 body lengths. Nothing in the written protocol said anything at all about what to do when the animal stopped moving and started taking your measure from a distance. Stood with my rod at my side, barrel down, full charge, and I looked at the Vel-Krath. Stood like that for somewhere between 15 and 30 seconds. I didn't have a good count on it. Long enough that I became aware of Tevsor, 2 positions ahead of me, making the very small movement Velathri make with their tertiary limbs when they are recalibrating a threat assessment. True enough that Dresh Orva said very quietly without turning his head, "Cadet Vasquez, your rod." "It's at my side," I said. "Barrel down. I'm within protocol." A pause. "Raise it to ready position. It's 4 body lengths away." "Cadet." I raised the rod to ready position. The Vel-Krath held for another 2 seconds, then withdrew to the center of the pen. Not the deliberate retreat of the previous session. This one was faster, covering the ground in 4 strides. And when it reached the center, it turned and sat in the observation posture and pointed all 4 eyes at the ceiling, which was, according to the species file, the posture it used when it was processing new information. The session continued. The Vel-Krath made 2 more approach and withdraw cycles, standard. Rod engaged at 2 body lengths, animal stopped, animal retreated. At the end of the session, Dresh Orva filed his report and ran the debrief, and when he got to me, he said, "Cadet Vasquez, your response to my order." "I was within protocol," I said. "You were within the protocol's written boundary," he said. "You were not within its intent. The intent of the protocol is that every cadet presents the same response to the animal. Unified front, uniform compliance rod position, so that the animal's behavioral conditioning receives consistent input across the entire handler group. When one cadet deviates, even within written boundary, the consistency breaks." "The consistency didn't break," I said. "The animal stopped at 4 body lengths. It didn't approach. I raised the rod when you asked me to." Dresh Orva's lower pair of eyes held on me for a long moment. The upper pair were still looking at the session log on his tablet. This is a Keth expression I had been trying to correctly read since the rotation began, and I had decided it meant something in the neighborhood of, "I am giving this more weight than my first instinct suggested." "You will follow full protocol in session 3, he said. "At ready position from the moment you step through the gate." "Yes, sir," he filed the debrief. In the variance notes he wrote, "Cadet Vasquez, human, delayed rod ready position within written boundary, corrected immediately on instruction. Animal deviation, approach to 4 body lengths of rearline cadet, sonar sampling, posture, voluntary withdrawal prior to rod engagement, flag for review." I read that log that night because the session logs were public access files. under the Academy's academic transparency rule, and I thought about the word conditioning. The Vel-Krath had been in that pen for 63 years. It had seen the compliance rod engaged at 2 body lengths so many times that it had stopped moving at 2 body lengths before the rod could engage, which was not conditioning toward compliance. It was conditioning toward anticipation. The animal had learned that the rod came at 2 body lengths, so it stopped at 2 body lengths. But that wasn't the same as accepting dominance. It was playing the game at the edge of the rule it had figured out. Every session, every cohort, every handler for 6 decades. Approach to 2, stop, draw, return to center. The same game. I thought about what happens when you play the same game with a smart animal for 63 years. I thought about the 23-year-old session log. 11 seconds, at 1 body length. No injury. Voluntary withdrawal. I thought about Vel-Krath, now a senior researcher on the second continent. 14 papers, no injuries. Then I thought about the specific thing Dresh had said. The intent of the protocol is that every cadet presents the same response to the animal. Unified front. Uniform compliance rod position, so that the animal's behavioral conditioning receives consistent input. Consistent input. Session 3 was in the morning. I was up before the 3rd bell, before anyone else in the cohort, and I went to the 2nd library and I pulled Vel-Krath's 14 research papers, and I read them. She worked in behavioral ecology. Primary line of inquiry was what she called the threshold model of apex predator habituation. The idea that the obstacle to genuine habituation, in species like the Vel-Krath, was not the animal's neurological capacity for learning, which was substantial, but the consistency of the inputs the animal received from the habituating entity. Could not habituate an apex predator by giving it the same defensive input every time. Defensive inputs, compliance rods, barriers, loud commands, territorial posturing, produce threat response suppression, looked like habituation from the outside, but was neurologically distinct. The animal was not learning that you weren't a threat. The animal was learning that you were a threat it couldn't currently overcome. True habituation required something different. Required the animal to arrive at an independent classification of the encountering entity. Its own determination through chemical, sonar, and behavioral sampling of what category the entity belonged to. Threat, resource neither. Most entities the Vel-Krath had ever encountered in captivity, that classification was already made. Threat. The compliance rod made it. The uniform posture made it. The chemical stress signals from Keth biology made it. Every new cohort smelled, moved, and behaved identically to every previous cohort, so the animal's classification remained identical session after session, decade after decade. What Vel-Krath had found in 23 years of field work was that the Vel-Krath in wild populations were remarkably tolerant of species that they had classified as neither threat nor resource. Smaller prey animals that were inedible to them. Certain bird analog species that nested in their territorial ranges. Even in 2 documented cases, individual members of species that were standard prey, individuals who had, through some combination of biology and behavior, produced a stimulus profile the Vel-Krath had filed as outside the predator-prey category. Her conclusion, stated carefully in the final section of her most recent paper, was that the captive management model for apex predators of the Vel-Krath's classification had likely been selecting for the wrong outcome for a very long time. I closed the last file at the 5th bell, sat in the library for a while. The 3rd session was in 2 hours. I thought about what I was going to do, and then I thought about what Dresh was going to do when I did it. And then I thought about the Vel-Krath Cadet, who had left the pen on a stretcher, with both tertiary limbs broken, and about the 41 injury reports I had read, and about the specific word voluntary in a session log filed 23 years ago. The thing about a pen with an animal that can kill you is that there are 2 ways to be in it. You can be in it as a threat, and the animal will manage you accordingly. With suppression and distance and the constant low-level calculation of whether you're worth the energy of confrontation, or you can be in it as something else. And to be something else, you have to be willing to let the animal make that determination on its own terms. Without the rod as a mediating variable, I was not going to enter that pen without a rod. I wasn't suicidal, and I wasn't arrogant about it. I was going to enter with the rod in the correct position, and I was going to keep it in the correct position for the entire session, and I was not going to deviate from protocol in any way that Dresh Orva could cite in a debrief. But I was also going to do what I had been doing in every pen since I was 11 years old, which is stand very still, smell like myself, and wait for the animal to decide what I am. The third session began like the first two. North gate, single file, compliance rods at full charge and ready position, Dresh Orva at the front, me at the end. The entry tone sequence. The Vel-Krath, rising from the center of the pen in the upright chemical sampling posture. Forward limbs elevated, sonar running. Was different in session 3 was the approach sequence. It came to the front of the line first, same as before. Rod engaged at 2 body lengths. Animal stopped, held, withdrew, once, then it did not return to the center. It turned left along the line and moved, still upright, still sampling, with the particular flowing gait of something that is covering ground, without committing to any single vector. Past Orvendeth, past the 2 Keth second years, past Sela. It stopped in front of Tevsor at 6 body lengths, held for 2 seconds, then moved on. It came to a stop in front of me at 3 body lengths. Tevsor was between it and Drishorva, put the rod at 8 body lengths from the animal, which was outside the engagement range by a substantial margin. I was looking at it, and the sonar was running. I couldn't hear it, but I could feel the air pressure of it, a very faint and regular interval against the skin of my face and hands. And I kept my rod at ready position, and I thought, here, this is the moment. Either you are a thing that fits the category it already has, or you're something it has to build a new drawer for. You don't get to push it either direction. You just have to be whatever you actually are, and let it make the call. 3 body lengths. The animal held for what the session log would later record as 19 seconds. 19 seconds at 3 body lengths. Sonar running, forward limbs elevated, all 4 eyes at different focal lengths. Close reading, the species file called it the multi-plane optical assessment a Vel-Krath uses when it is doing detailed biological classification of a new subject. Dreshorva's voice, controlled, Vasquez, status. Holding, I said. The animal is within 2.9 body lengths, I said, still outside 2. A sound from Dresh Orva that I hadn't heard him make before. Not a word. Not Keth stress chemistry, he had too much discipline for that. Just the sound of a person recalibrating very quickly. The Vel-Krath lowered its forward limbs. Not the combat lowering of the approach. A different angle. The flat horizontal that the species file listed as the neutral carry position, the posture used when the forward limbs aren't engaged in either hunting or defense. It stood there for another 4 seconds with its limbs in neutral, and all 4 eyes pointing approximately at my chest, and then it turned, smoothly, and walked back toward the center of the pen. Not the withdrawal pattern from the previous sessions, not the fast retreat of session 2. It walked to the center of the pen at the same pace it had come from it. No urgency, no threat response. And when it reached the center, it folded its limbs beneath it in the observation posture and pointed its eyes at the north wall, not at the ceiling, at the wall. Dreshorva ran 3 more approach withdraw cycles in the remaining session time. Standard protocol, rod at 2 body lengths, animal stopped, animal retreated. All 3 cycles ran without incident. At the end of the session, we exited through the north gate single file and stood in the observation gallery while he filed the session report and said nothing for an unusually long time. The debrief was short. Physical status reports, no injuries, no deviations from protocol. At my turn I said, no injuries, no deviations, rod at ready position throughout. He looked at me with his lower pair of eyes. You knew it was going to stop. Thought it might. How? I told him about Ursevit's papers, not all 14. The key argument, the threshold model, the distinction between threat-response suppression and genuine habituation. The chemical sampling posture in sessions 2 and 3, the neutral carry position at the end. I kept it factual. He was a master handler with 19 years of pen experience, and I was 17. I was aware of both of those things while I was talking. He listened without expression, which in Keth means they are processing with full attention and reserving judgment. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Sevithos. Yes, sir. I trained her, he said. I hadn't known that. I waited. She left that session log in the archive because I asked her not to file a standard variance note, he said. The animal had come within 1 body length of a cadet with no rod engagement and no injury, and the standard system had no incident category that covered a non-injurious, unauthorized close approach, resulting in voluntary animal withdrawal. The default would have been a protocol breach flag on my record, and an animal behavior escalation notice on hers. Neither of those categories fit what actually happened. He looked at the session report on his tablet, then at the pen below the observation glass, where the Vel-Krath was sitting in the observation posture with its eyes on the north wall. So she wrote, "Behavior atypical, no proximate cause identified," he said, and I filed it under variance no action and moved on. And then she graduated and went to the second continent and published 14 papers that I have read every one of. And I have never been able to figure out how to use them in this pen without reopening a 23-year-old incident note that would generate more administrative review than the work would be worthy. The quality of the silence after that was specific, the kind that means a person has said something they have been not saying for a long time. "Her model works," I said. "Her model requires," he said carefully, "a cadet who can stand at 3 body lengths from a Vel-Krath without generating a threat stimulus profile, which in 63 years and 41 injured handler trainees, I have not been able to reliably produce through any training methodology I have access to. I don't know if I produced it," I said. "I don't know what I smell like to a Vel-Krath. I know what I was doing. I can describe what I was doing." "Yes," he said, "I know you can." He set the tablet down on the gallery railing. His secondary ribcage did a very small thing that I had come to understand was the Keth equivalent of a long exhale. "I need to file a session report that accurately describes what happened in that pen today. I do not currently have a form category that covers it." I thought about the 2 session logs from 63 years of records that had said, "Behavior atypical, no proximate cause identified. Create one," I said. He looked at me, both pairs of eyes. "I'm sorry," I said. "That's not my call." "No," he said, "but you're not wrong." He picked up the tablet. "I'm going to ask you to come to the pen again. We have 2 more sessions scheduled. Not as a cohort session," he said. "As an observation exercise. You, me, the animal. No other cadets, no protocol requirement. I want to watch what you do, not to replicate it. I don't know if it's replicable, but to understand what I'm looking at before I decide how to file it." I said yes. Obviously, I said yes. It was Dresh Orva asking, and it was a Vel-Krath pen, and I was 17, and none of the things I wanted to do with my life involved walking away from either. The observation session was 4 days later. The morning after the rest of the cohort's final scheduled session, which had been routine. Dresh Orva and I at the north gate at the 6th bell, no other cadets, 1 pliance rod which he carried and I did not. He told me to do what I had been doing. I told him I couldn't describe it much better than I already had. "I know," he said. "Show me." We went through the north gate. The Vel-Krath was in the center of the pen in the observation posture. It rose when the gate latched, not the hunting crouch, the upright sampling posture, but something between, the limbs unfolding to a carry position that I hadn't seen in the 3 prior sessions. It oriented toward us, all 4 eyes finding Dresh Orva first and then sliding to me. I walked away from Dresh Orva, not toward the Vel-Krath. I wasn't doing that. Not without a much longer history in this specific pen with this specific animal. Perpendicular, the east wall, which put me 40 meters from the animal and 15 meters from Dresh Orva. I stopped and stood. What I did next is not something I know how to explain in terms the Academy has a form category for. I stood still, not the stiffened spine still, of someone trying not to show that they're afraid, the other kind. The kind where you've stopped doing the work of managing what you look like, and you're just in the place you're in, at the right scale for it, not trying to be larger than you are, and not trying to be smaller. I've stood that way next to bulls and feral dogs and 1 specific mule named Diablo who had put 3 ranch hands in the clinic, and who spent 40 minutes sniffing my hair before he decided I was acceptable company. I don't know what it looks like from the outside. I know what it produces sometimes. The Vel-Krath came to me in the neutral carry posture, covered the 40 meters in about 90 seconds, which for its size and stride was not rushing. It stopped at 2 body lengths, And I had a very clear sense of Dresh Orva behind me making no move toward his rod, and then the Vel-Krath lowered its head, and the forward limbs went to a position I hadn't seen before, which was close to the ground. The species file said was a posture used in social encounters between members of the same population. I did not move. I breathed. The animal took 2 more steps and stopped at 1 body length. I could hear the sonar now, not feel it, actually hear it. The way you hear a very high frequency if the room is absolutely quiet. Regular, patient. The way it sounded was the way a question sounds, when the person asking it is not in a hurry for the answer. We stood like that for a while. I don't know exactly how long. Long enough that when the Vel-Krath finally turned and walked back to the center of the pen, I realized my hands had unclenched at some point without my noticing. Dresh Orva was standing at the north wall with his rod at his side and his 4 eyes arranged in the expression I had finally worked out meant, I am going to need to revise something significant. Savath did that, he said. I know, I said. She came to me the day before she graduated, he said. She told me the threshold model was correct, and that the protocol was selecting for the wrong behavioral outputs, and that she was going to spend her career proving it, and that she hoped I would read her papers. I told her that I would, and that her model was theoretically compelling, and that I forward to seeing the field data. He paused. That was 31 years ago. I waited. I've read every paper, he said. 14 of them. I agree with all of it. I have not changed the protocol. He looked at the Vel-Krath, which was back in the center of the pen, in the observation posture, with its eyes on the north wall, the same place it had been pointing them after session 3. The wall where the north gate was. Do you know what the obstacle is? Not administratively, the actual obstacle. You'd have to produce a cadet who could stand at 1 body length from that animal without a rod, I said. Shh. And you'd have to do it without anyone getting hurt in the process of building the training model to produce that cadet. Gets hurt in the process, the protocol escalation review closes down the experiment and you're back to square one with 42 injured handler trainees instead of 41. Yes, he said. That is the obstacle. He was quiet for a moment. Came through this pen without a plan to get hurt. I didn't know I wasn't going to get hurt, I said. I had a theory. It was a reasonable theory. But I was also ready to move if I needed to. What would you have done? Dropped to the floor and covered my head, I said. It's not a sophisticated plan. It limits the target area for the forward limbs. It's what works when something much larger than you has already committed to a movement you can't outrun. He made the sound again. The one that wasn't a Keth stress marker, wasn't a word, just the sound of a person. Landing on something that had been in the air for too long. Then he did something I hadn't seen him do in 3 cohort sessions and 1 observation session. He sat down. Not on anything, just on the pen floor. In the easy folded limb posture the Keth use when they're in a room they expect to be in for a while. The compliance rod on the floor beside him. Sit down, he said. I sat down. The Vel-Krath was still pointing its eyes at the north wall. Going to contact her 7th os. Dresh Orva said. I should have done it 15 years ago. I'm going to tell her that I have a human cadet in the predator handling rotation who walked to within 1 body length of the captive Vel-Krath without incident, and that I believe her model is correct, and that I would like to discuss what a revised training protocol would require to pilot safely. He paused. I'm also going to file a session report for this morning. I don't have a form category for it. I'm going to create one. Behavioral contact, non-injurious novel stimulus profile, I said. That's what her papers call it. That's what I'll call it, he said. He looked at me for a moment. How old are you? 17. How did you know to read her papers? I read the session logs, I said. All 912 of them. The 2 variance notes that said no proximate cause identified were the only unexplained outcomes in 60 years. If you want to understand something, you start with the things that don't fit. Dresh Orva looked at the pen, at the Vel-Krath, which had shifted its eye orientation again during our conversation, the way it did sometimes without moving anything else. The upper pair now on. Dresh Orva, the lower pair on me. It's watching both of us, I said. It's been watching both of us since you sat down, he said. Posture changed when I sat. Did you notice? I looked. He was right. The architectural fold of the limbs. The one I had filed as observation posture was different now. Less weight on the rear pair, the forward pair angled at a lower carry. I went back through the species file, in my memory looking for the description of that posture. I couldn't place it. It's not in the captive behavior file, Dresh said. I've only seen it twice before in this animal. Times was when staff members were in the pen doing maintenance work and didn't know the animal could see them through the service hatch. It had no reason to expect their presence. It wasn't threat response. It wasn't approach preparation. It was. He stopped. He was looking at the Vel-Krath with his lower pair of eyes, and there was something in his expression that I hadn't seen in him before. Not the calculating assessment of the master handler. Something older. Curiosity, I said. Yes, he said. We sat in the pen for another 40 minutes. The Vel-Krath stayed in the center. It didn't approach again. I hadn't expected it to, and I didn't think Dresh had either. What it did was what it had been doing since we sat down. Watch. Upper pair on one of us. Lower pair on the other, switching at irregular intervals that didn't follow any pattern I could identify, taking the measure of two things that were sitting on the floor of its pen without rods, and without the stress chemistry of threat, and without the performance of dominance that 63 years of handler protocol had told it was the only thing that ever came through that gate. The pen had a particular quality of quiet in it. Not silence. The sonar was always running somewhere in the background. The Vel-Krath doing its continuous environmental mapping the way a submarine does. Constant and low, and mostly below the level of conscious detection. But the human scale sounds were absent. No commands, no bootsteps at the north wall, no compliance rod charge cycling. Dresh sat with his hands in his lap and his eyes moving slowly between the animal and the floor in front of him, and after about 10 minutes he said, very quietly, and not really to me, in 19 years in this pen I have never sat down in it. I didn't say anything. I have walked through it 104 times, he said, always moving, always with the rod in hand. Protocol requires it. He paused. The protocol does not actually require it. Standing still at the north wall is the protocol. The rod in hand is the protocol. I have added moving because standing still while the animal watches me has always felt insufficiently controlled. He looked at the Vel-Krath. Sitting down is outside any category I was trained in. How does it feel? I asked. He considered this for a moment with the expression that meant he was translating from his own conceptual register. Like a conversation I've been avoiding, he said. The Vel-Krath adjusted its eye direction again. Lower pair to Dresh now, pair scanning the ceiling. The sonar interval shifted. Slightly shorter, slightly higher frequency. Close mapping mode. The species file would have called it. The register used for detailed work at shorter range. It was measuring us again. From here, sitting on the floor of its pen as something new. When we left, it watched us go. Dresh contacted Sevath Os that afternoon. This, because 3 days later I replied to his message and copied me on it, which was either an oversight or a deliberate choice. Given what the med said, I suspected it was deliberate. She wrote that she was very glad to hear from him, that she had been hoping for this contact for a long time, and that she believed a revised pilot protocol for gradual habituation stimulus training was feasible, and that she would be prepared to co-design it if he was willing to open the project through the Academy's research partnership track. She also wrote, in a separate paragraph at the end of the message, I understand there is a human first-year cadet in your current cohort who made it to one body length without incident. I would very much like to speak with him. The threshold model predicts this is possible. I have believed for 30 years that it is possible. It is different to be told it actually happened. I sat with that message for a while, 31 years, 14 papers. The patience of a person who has been right about something for 3 decades and has kept working anyway, kept filing the data, kept building the model, waiting for the pen to produce a result that matched the theory. I wrote her back. I told her what I had done and what I had thought and what my background was. I kept it factual. I told her about the cattle ranch and the mule named Diablo and the specific quality of stillness that I had learned from standing in pens where the animal on the other side of the fence was making a decision about me. I told her I didn't know how to teach it, but that I thought it was teachable because I hadn't been born with it. Someone had shown me, not in a classroom, in a field, in Sonora, when I was 11, by a woman who managed a herd that had a history of injuring ranch hands and who had told me, in terms I hadn't fully understood at the time, the animal already knows what you are. Your job is to let it be right. I sent the message and went to class. The session report that Dresh filed that day became the first entry in a category he called non-standard behavioral contact, apex predator, voluntary approach and withdrawal, no injurious outcome. The form was 4 pages. He told me later that it had taken him 2 hours to write, because the Academy's reporting system had to be manually patched to accept a new incident category, which required sign-off from the Academy Registrar's office, which required an explanatory memo, which required him to summarize 63 years of Vel-Krath captive management history in 2 paragraphs and explain why a 17-year-old human cadet standing still for 19 seconds had generated a result the prior 41 trainees had not. The memo, he also told me, taken him longer to write than the form. The Academy Registrar's Office stamped it approved in the category of experimental observation protocols, pending research partnership review. Sevath's project application went in 6 weeks later. The formal approval came through the term after I rotated out of the Predator handling module and moved on to Advanced Systems Integration, which was on the other side of the Academy campus, and had very different problems. But the Vel-Krath was still in the pen. Dresh was still there with it. And somewhere between the session report and the registrar's memo and the 14 papers that had been waiting for 31 years to matter in the specific place they'd been written to matter, the pen had something new in it. Not a protocol, something older than a protocol, a question. The kind the animal asks when it's in the observation posture with its eyes on the north wall, watching the gate, waiting to see what comes through next. I think about that sometimes, about the Vel-Krath and about Diablo and about the woman in Sonora who had said, "The animal already knows what you are, your job is to let it be right." She was talking about a mule. She had no idea she was talking about anything else. She was right anyway. She usually was.